Hey boys and girls, it's Mrs. Couchman. I am going to start reading the book Ranger in Time, Night of Soldiers and Spies. And this is the cover, this is what it looks like. And this is one of the books that Mrs. Clark got from the author Kate Messner when she was in Lake Placid. Remember, that's where Mrs. James lives. And it says inside, for Ballard 4th graders, and she signed her name. So let's start. I'm going to start. Chapter 1, No Lights, No Sound. Isaac Pope held the flat-bottomed boat steady while soldiers waded into the river and loaded supplies. Quickly, an officer whispered through the pounding rain. We must have every man across before dawn. Isaac nodded but didn't answer aloud. No lights, no sound. That was the order. This mission had to be silent and secret. Anything else would mean disaster. The boat sank lower in the water until Isaac signaled that it was full. He and the other sailors of the 14th Continental Regiment used poles to push off from shore. It was their second trip of the night. Their task felt impossible. Ferry 9,000 troops across the mile-long stretch of river between Long Island and New York. Horses and supplies had to be moved too, all before the sun came up and British troops realized the American rebels were fleeing. Anyone left behind would be taken prisoner. For 2 days, General George Washington's Continental Army had battled British soldiers in the rain, but then the rebels found themselves surrounded. All day, British troops had ventured closer, digging ditches so they could advance without being exposed to gunfire. In another day, they'd be within musket range, and Washington's army would have to surrender. The revolution would be over almost as soon as it begun. Crossing the East River in darkness was their only hope. Isaac pulled harder on his oar. His head had been pounding all day. His muscles were aching even before he started rowing. Now they burned with every stroke. But if anyone can get this job done, it was the men of the 14th Continental Regiment. Most had been sailors and fishermen together in Marblehead, Massachusetts, before they signed up for the Continental Army. When the British had closed the Grand Banks to fishing, Isaac and the other men were furious. How would they provide for their families? That was when many of Marblehead's fishermen made the decision to join the Patriot cause and fight for independence from Great Britain. The commander of the regiment was Colonel John Glover, who took pride in his fishermen's determination and bravery. They had faced long journeys at sea together. They had weathered the wild storms of the Great Banks. Now General Washington was trusting them with his entire army. When the New York shore was near and the water shallow enough, the soldiers piled out. Isaac shivered and headed back for another trip. His whole body shook with chills. He was weak with hunger. The driving rain and wind had made it nearly impossible to fight fires for cooking. He'd eaten nothing but raw pork and rock-hard biscuits for 2 days, and there were still so many troops to move. When Isaac's boat made it back to Brooklyn Heights, the men were fretting and whispering. One of the soldiers leaned into him. "The tide's turning," he hissed. "Between that and the wind, we can't navigate the slopes anymore. We won't make it." Isaac looked at his flat-bottomed boat, already filling with anxious men. Without larger slopes helping to move men, they'd never get everyone across the river before dawn. Isaac felt dizzy. He imagined the redcoats walking at first light to find hundreds of Continental soldiers trapped in Brooklyn. Isaac's ears still rang from the gunfire of the day before. He had crouched behind a stone wall, his heart pounding against the musket he'd held tight to his chest. They'd fought bravely, but how long could they go on? George Washington's troops were beaten down. They'd held out for 2 days against an army twice their size. But now they were surrounded. Could they possibly escape before dawn? I'm going to go on to read chapter 2. Pop, boom, bang. Happy 4th of July, Ranger, Luke said. I saved the last piece of my hot dog for you. He leaned down and fed it to Ranger under the picnic table. Ranger was just finishing when he saw a flash of brown out of the corner of his eye. Ranger was just... Oh, squirrel! Ranger darted out from under the table and chased the squirrel all around the yard. He chased it past Mom's garden, up the porch steps, and down again. When the squirrel climbed a tree, Ranger sat at the bottom, barking. Got outrun again, Ranger, Sadie said and bent down to pat his head. That was all right. Ranger didn't know what he'd do if he ever caught a squirrel anyway. He just liked chasing them. Squirrels were the reason Ranger wasn't an official search and rescue dog. Ranger had done all kinds of training with Luke and Dad. He'd practiced finding Luke in the woods and in big warehouses with boxes all over. He'd even practiced finding him when Luke was buried in the snow. Ranger was very good at finding people. But to be an official search and rescue dog, you had to pass the test. And to pass the test, you had to ignore everything except your job. You had to ignore cats and crowds of people and juicy hot dogs dropped in front of you. You even had to ignore squirrels. On the day of Ranger's test, a squirrel had run right out in front of him. Ranger chased it, even though Dad said no. Ranger knew Luke wasn't really lost. He was just pretending. If a real person had needed help, Ranger would have left the squirrel alone. But that didn't matter. He didn't pass his test, so he didn't get to be a search and rescue dog. Now he could chase as many squirrels as he liked. Finish up and let's clear the table, Mom said. We should get Ranger inside before the fireworks start. Ranger loved 4th of July hot dogs, but he didn't like the fireworks one bit. They hurt his ears. He always hid under the blanket in his dog bed until the popping and booming ended. Ranger followed Luke and Sadie inside. He stayed in the mud room while they went to the kitchen to get marshmallows. As soon as they left, Ranger heard a soft humming sound coming from his bed. Ranger pawed at his blanket until he uncovered the old first aid kit he dug up from the garden one day. The humming was louder now. Ranger had heard that sound before. The old metal box only hummed when someone far away needed Ranger's help. Once, it had taken him to a giant ship that was about to sink in a frigid sea. Another time, it had taken him to a dusty prairie where a boy and his family was starting out on a dangerous journey. And once, it had taken him to a city shaken by an earthquake where a girl and her friend were running from fires. Now the first aid kit was humming again. Ranger lowered his head and nuzzled the strap over his neck. The humming got louder. Light spilled from the cracks in the old metal box. It grew brighter and brighter. Too bright. Ranger had to close his eyes. He felt as if he were being squeezed through a hole in the sky. Suddenly, the humming stopped. Ranger opened his eyes. It was half dark out, just like it had been at home, but a cool rain had replaced the warm summer weather. Fog and whispers floated through the air as men ran quietly toward a riverbank. Hush now and hurry, one of them ordered. We're running out of time. Now I wonder what's going to happen. Is Ranger, has he gone back maybe in time? We'll have to find out the next time I read. Goodbye, boys and girls.